Hello, everybody, and welcome to the EIB Benelux Pavilion here at COP28 in Dubai. We're delighted to see all of you here at the pavilion, and welcome also to those of you joining us online as well. We're talking about a hugely important issue today, how communities, both in Europe and in the rest of the world, can be supported in the radical transformations that we are undergoing already. Accelerating a just transition and just resilience globally is the topic of what we'll be talking about in a minute with our esteemed panelists here, and then a group of experts to take us into what that actually means. Today, the European Investment Bank is actually launching its new approach to just transition globally, but also an idea of just resilience globally. What does that mean? This is what our speakers are going to help us decipher. What can we learn from what we've already experienced within Europe, but also what can we learn from those partners in developing countries who are already facing the impacts of climate change? So without further ado, I'm really delighted to have with us a group of people who can help us do just that. Let me introduce you to them first of all, and then I will invite them. We have Kadri Simpson, who is the Commissioner, the European Union's Commissioner for Energy. Thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner Simpson. We have Vice President Ambroise Fayol, who is the Vice President at the European Investment Bank in charge of climate and environment, but also development. Hugely important nexus there. We're delighted also to have Madame Ministre from the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, who is the Minister for Environment and also Sustainable Development. And Dr. Musunda from the Wetlands Ramsar Convention on Wetlands as well. Thank you, all of you. Let me hand over to you, Commissioner Simpson, first of all. Maybe if you'd like to use the microphone here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and good morning, and thank you for having me, because just transition is a very important concept also for European Commission. You might know that in 2019 we announced our new program for this mandate, and one of the flagship initiatives was European Green Deal. And this is our climate and energy policy that actually sets a new pathway and vision where there is no long-term energy mix, where coal and other solid fossil fuels are economically viable. And doing so, of course, we knew that across Europe we do have member states where there are still regions and communities who are getting their income due to the mining activities. During the past 2 years, Europe has faced very severe situation. We have had the difficult years of energy crisis. That meant that we had to accelerate our green transition. At the same time, also few EU member states had to put some of the plans to close coal-fired power plants on hold. But it was only temporary emergency measure, however, and all our member states, in fact, remained committed to their coal phase-out plans and dates. And under our REPower EU plan, the EU became even more ambitious, and renewable energy and energy efficiency improvements made now sense, even more than before. And we are doing what it takes to deliver this accelerated transition fairly and justly, leaving no one, no region behind. And let me explain this approach. First, the EU has long-standing experience phasing out coal power. And we have established a robust framework for regions and communities most affected by the move away from coal. Our just transition mechanism is mobilizing around 55 billion euros between 2021 and 2027 alone. And we have also set up a social climate fund of similar size to help the most vulnerable to green their heating and transport. And our aim is to help coal regions diversify economic activities and offer alternative employment opportunities for workers, including through reskilling and training, so that they don't have to leave their homes when mining activities are not giving them income anymore. And finally, we want to ensure that citizens and communities across Europe are fully involved in driving this energy transition. So our focus is on supporting energy sharing, energy communities, and peer-to-peer trading. And this just transition is not only for European necessity. The global clean energy transition must work for everyone, and clearly it doesn't matter where the people who are still active on mining sector live. And the European Commission is glad to contribute to the development of a global platform for coal regions covering 8 countries outside the European Union. And this will be a useful channel to share knowledge on policies and approaches for a just transition at international level. Right now, the EU also supports a just transition energy partnership concept initiated by G7 members. And this led to the signing of ambitious deals on energy transition with South Africa in 2021 already, and last year with Indonesia and Vietnam. And more broadly, the European Commission wants to continue engaging with partners around the world on the international dimension of the just transition. And this is why today's launch is so important. So I want to commend the EIB global approach to a just transition and just resilience, because your work is pioneering, and you are the ones on the ground helping us to deliver the transformative change our world needs. So thank you for this engagement, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Commissioner. Thank you, and I know you have to run, but we're very grateful for your participation. Thanks a lot. So let's just turn to our panelists here and maybe pick up on a few things that the Commissioner brought up there. Maybe I can start with you, Vice President. We know that the EIB is partnering very closely on the EU's just transition mechanism, and now is looking to globalize that approach in terms of just transition, as well as to adopt, and this is what we're announcing today as well, a just resilience approach globally, which supports those communities and those geographies who are feeling the most acute impacts of climate change. So tell us a little bit about what the bank has already learnt in terms of its work on the just transition, and also how that could develop and where you think we need to do more.
Thank you so much, Shirin. Let me have a step back and say where this debate started in Europe. And it started with the way we handled, we Europeans, particularly in Western Europe, we handled actually not well, the decommissioning of mining, the problems that those companies that had to close down were not really successful in the way they dealt with their workers. And that's what we had in mind when we put in place a few years ago the Climate Bank Roadmap. And when we did that with the objective to strengthen considerably the climate financing of EIB, we had discussions with our shareholders, and our shareholders are the member states of the European Union. And the Climate Bank Roadmap was approved unanimously. And it was the case because we have been able to tell, especially those member states in Eastern Europe where they have more to do in terms of closing down some very, very polluting energy sources, that they would get more financing, and they would get more financing for helping them deal with disclosures in terms of, for example, reskilling, upskilling the workers, these kind of things. And that allowed us to have a unanimous decision at the board of EIB. And as the commissioner said, this is the basis for what we call the just transition mechanism. So we are already implementing it. We have already done in the European Union 9 investments in 6 member states for around 200 million euros. That is what we have put in place. The lessons we have learned: one, go local. There is no such thing as one size fits all when you implement the solutions in the field for the just transition. Two, build back better. So try to broaden. When you do this kind of policies and financing, try to broaden the spectrum of what you look at. Look at, for example, gender policy in the geography that you are dealing with your just transition. The same way we deal with the just energy transition programs outside of the European Union, in Vietnam, in South Africa, etc. And three, focus more on adaptation. And that is what actually was missing, that we are dealing with the direct consequences of decommissioning. We are not dealing with those who are, especially the poorest part of the population, in countries that are not directly affected by decommissioning, for example, but are directly affected by the consequences of climate change that is already there. And we need to include them in the just mechanism. And I say just because this is the difference between what we call the just transition and the just resilience. And we are starting to implement actually the team more, and Roman will come back to present what we have worked on and what we have come to an agreement with our board on. In terms of just resilience, but just to give you 2 examples, one that we have signed actually, we discussed that yesterday with Minister Camara of Mauritania. It is in the context of TURF. TURF is the Urban Resilience Facility or Fund that is implementing by a French asset manager called Meridiam, and the topic of the investment of fund is the city of Nouakchott. That is under threat because of adaptation, actually. Yeah? They have to adapt to the fact that there are rising sea levels, there are more extreme temperatures, there are more extreme weather events, etc. We are going to help them with dealing with this very difficult situation. And the second example that I had in mind was Cofina. We signed that already also this year. It's an agricultural fund specialized in helping adapt the agricultural value chain for cocoa, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, for cashew nuts, in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. This is the just resilience. How you do that for those who are dealing with agriculture and the consequence of climate change that is already there for the farmers. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And thank you for highlighting a couple of those projects, because that's going to be very important as we move along operationalizing this approach, is to have inspiring models like the project in Mauritania, where Minister, Your Excellency, we discussed that yesterday, where we have potentially a very good model of what it looks like to involve the community and to work with those who are really on the front line of climate change. And you are on the front line of climate change in Mauritania. You know more than most what that is like. So I'd like to ask you, how are you working with partners to finance the kinds of projects, the kinds of initiatives that will actually support the communities who are on the front line? I'm going to pass you the microphone. Je ne sais pas si vous préférez parler en français or whatever you want. We'll take.
Thank you very much again for inviting me and for highlighting and putting, I will say, light on my country. I really appreciate it. I will be speaking French. I want to make sure that also the Francophone can enjoy the COP, because it's not obvious. Everything is in English, so we, in West Francophone Africa, it's important that we also speak in French. Donc je vous remercie infiniment encore une fois de mettre la lumière sur la Mauritanie. Nous sommes un vaste pays, 1 million de kilomètres carrés en Afrique de l'Ouest, entre le Maroc et le Sénégal. Et il est vrai que c'est un sujet qui nous concerne de très près. C'est vrai qu'on parle de transition juste, mais comme l'a dit mon voisin, il est important de rappeler effectivement que l'adaptation est une question cruciale pour nos populations. La transition juste, certainement, parce qu'effectivement, il s'agit de mitiguer, en tout cas de réduire les gaz à émissions, de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, et de réduire effectivement la température et de la maintenir à 1,5. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous sommes tous à ces COP tous les ans. Ceci étant dit, les impacts du changement climatique sur nos populations sont une réalité quotidienne. Les températures, le manque d'eau, les sécheresses, la désertification, qui entraînent vraiment des conditions de vie de plus en plus difficiles pour les populations du Sud. Bien sûr, le nerf de la guerre, effectivement, c'est avoir les moyens de financer cette adaptation. Mais pour le cas de la Mauritanie, comme beaucoup de pays vulnérables, beaucoup de pays du Sud, nous avons signé toutes les conventions, j'ai envie de dire. La Convention climat, nous avions mis en place nos plans nationaux d'adaptation, nous avons mis également en place notre CDN qui a été révisé en 2021. Donc nous avons tout j'ai envie de dire, un arsenal de plans d'action, mais également de projets bien identifiés dans tous les secteurs d'activité qui nous permettent aujourd'hui effectivement d'avoir une feuille de route très claire. Nous avons également, avec d'autres pays, lancé des initiatives telles que l'initiative de la Grande Muraille Verte, non seulement pour justement effectivement mettre je dirais, en exergue et en application nos plans, à savoir les aspects purement environnementaux, de restauration des terres, de reboisement, pour créer effectivement des conditions aussi bien pour les secteurs productifs, tels que l'élevage, l'agriculture, les rendre résilients justement au changement climatique, mais également des plans d'action sur la résilience de nos villes. Parce qu'il faut savoir aujourd'hui que des villes comme Nouakchott ou comme Dakar sont inondées quasiment tous les ans. Et donc, ce qui crée encore plus, effectivement, je dirais, des difficultés pour les populations. Donc, on passe d'une sécheresse à une inondation et continuellement. Donc, il est important, effectivement, de penser nos villes, de faire en sorte, effectivement, que les populations ne soient pas, n'habitent pas dans des zones inondables, marécageuses. Et donc, ces aspects-là, mais aussi les aspects d'énergie. Aujourd'hui, il faut savoir que la Mauritanie comptait, avant les indépendances, 30 forêts classées, et que ces forêts classées ont perdu environ 110% de leur surface, dû à la coupe d'arbres, à la carbonisation, parce qu'il faut effectivement, les populations ont besoin d'énergie pour le quotidien, d'énergie également pour des activités génératrices de revenus. Donc il est important effectivement dans ces politiques d'adaptation que nous permettions aux populations d'accéder à d'énergie propre qui leur permettent justement effectivement de faire face. Donc on a également des programmes de mini-grid, en tout cas en zone rurale, parce qu'il est bien sûr pas rentable dans un pays d'1 million de kilomètres carrés d'avoir la Société nationale d'électricité qui couvrait tout le pays. Aujourd'hui, on a 53% de couverture en électricité, ce qui n'est pas mal du tout. On a un mix énergétique de 40% environ, c'est-à-dire 40% de notre énergie, de l'électricité que nous consommons déjà est déjà propre. Donc nous faisons énormément d'efforts dans ce sens-là, mais il reste quand même des zones qui ne sont pas encore couvertes, bien sûr, par même pas l'électricité, l'énergie de cuisson. Et donc, donc il est important de financer ces mini-grids, de rendre accessible l'énergie, justement pour réduire l'impact du changement climatique sur nos écosystèmes. Donc, en termes, pour faire tout cela, nous avons besoin d'une coopération. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, dans la CDN, nous avons estimé un besoin de 11 milliards le coût de l'adaptation et 30 milliards le coût de la mitigation. La mitigation, je pense on est sur la voie, il sera assez plus facile en tout cas de trouver les fonds, parce qu'effectivement, on parle d'hydrogène vert, on a un secteur privé qui est intéressé par cela, mais l'adaptation, les choses sont un peu plus compliquées, et donc c'est pourquoi la Mauritanie est également en avant-garde des négociations aujourd'hui sur les fonds tels que les fonds Loss and Damage, parce qu'il est important que nous ayons les moyens justement de financer cette adaptation. Voilà.
Thank you so much, Minister. And you touched on the important question of financing, which we haven't got into in any sort of granular way, but it's hugely important. As you said, this COP already in the first day made some good progress on agreeing the loss and damage fund, but clearly that is also about the damage already done, and we're also talking about what we need to go forward. We look forward to following the example in your capital city, Nouakchott, because I think there is a lot we can learn from that experience, not just for what we do in Africa and Asia, but also what we need to do in Europe ourselves, because it isn't just in the global south that we're feeling the impact of climate change. And so I think those policies that are putting the concept of just resilience into action in your city may be of great value to many. So thank you very much for that. Let me turn to Dr. Musunda. You've had a lot of experience as Secretary General of the Wetland Convention in exploring, writing about, talking about the intersection between adaptation and social inclusion. So maybe you can remind us, in a way, going back a few steps, why do we need a just resilience approach? Why do we need to make our adaptation finance more inclusive and scale it up so it really addresses the needs of the communities? I'm going to pass you the microphone.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'm so glad that I'm actually speaking last, because there's so many parts of the conversation from Vice President Fayol and Madame Camara, Her Excellency. I want to say our convention, the Wetlands Convention, is the oldest and most experienced multilateral environmental agreement. Started in 1971, it is 52 years old and older than the Climate Convention. So we have been everywhere. And we have experts, scientists, policymakers, and more fundamentally, assets. Mauritania is one of our contracting parties, with one of the best wetland systems on the edge of the Sahara. Now that system is where bird life that's migrating from Europe lands first before it continues. And this is where our connectivity happens, because wetland systems are not just the places that are providing water for us, they're also lifelines of protection. I visited here, I arrived a few days before COP started and went to Hojalba, which is one of our Ramsar sites here, mangrove system. 300, almost 400-year-old mangrove systems in the Gulf of, in the Gulf of Saudi Arabia Peninsula. And one freshwater source in Wadi Wuraya. It's a rock, it's dry. Colleagues, we're in the desert. You live in the desert. I mean, I come from the savannah in Zambia. I have never been here. I've never been in a desert country. But visiting here and understanding the value and importance, and I'm coming to the issue of just transition. So what we see as a convention is that we have a diverse spectrum of wetland system, mangrove system, seagrasses, river systems. I was looking at the Sentinel satellite imagery of Rio Negro. Rio Negro is our largest wetland system in Brazil in the whole world, 9 million hectares. And when you look, Google, if you want to do it right now, you will see that there's been a drought in the Amazon. Let's come back to Europe. I live in Switzerland. My children, we arrived late last year, very excited. They're in a school, first-time skiers. So the school organizes the ski events. They did one ski event, and then there was no more. I literally see the Alps every day. Danone is one of our partners. We've been in partnership with Danone for 25 years. Danone's water source is from a Ramsar site, Evian. It's the only private sector that has a Ramsar site under our convention. The Alps in Switzerland are the lifelines and the birthplaces of 4 river systems, big river systems in Europe: the Po, the Rhone, the Rhine, and the Danube. Give me the numbers, the populations, the cities, the investments, the shipping. When the rivers dried in Europe, people were freaked out. Because in a lot of people's mind, drought only happens in Africa, maybe a little bit in Asia or somewhere. But the reality of this climate change, everybody is going to be affected, and everybody is affected. So how do we just have this just transition and just resilient, and also with a very exceptional and important gender sensitive lens, because men and women are not affected the same. We're seeing it in Europe. We saw what COVID did. COVID, colleagues, took us back to 2008 poverty levels everywhere, everywhere. And so when we're talking about transition, about resilience, we're talking about systems. How resilient are those glaciers in the Alps? Energy. The fact that we have to cool all of those nuclear plant stations. If there's no water, sorry, there is no energy supply. Dams, hydroelectricity, water supply for drinking, for our very existence. So we begin to see the intersectionality of the very 3 pillars of sustainability: economics, social, and environmental, very neatly intertwined. Lastly but not the least, I want to say I recently visited Austria because Austria was celebrating the 40th anniversary of our convention, and it was fantastic. I love going to Vienna, and I did a lot of work on the Danube River system. And it was really fantastic to see that the city of Vienna has the first ever climate change adaptation strategy. And it's needed. Many parts of Europe right now are designing strategic markers really for their cities because it's important that it's done. And when we talk about just transition and resilience, we're also talking about restoration. Many of the countries here are members of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. If we have to restore ecosystems, we also have to look at the actual gender lens and tenure. When we talk in Africa, we're finding that when you talk to people about restoration, women don't own the land. Why should I be invested in restoring a space I don't own? So the intersectionality of these spaces are very intricately linked to the resilience conversation and to the justness of that transition. Madam Minister made reference to loss and damage. It was fantastic. First day of the COP, news, bang, bang, everybody excited. And then the reality hit. How much is enough? Colleagues, when we saw what happened in Pakistan, how much do you put on recovery? The women and children were hit the hardest in those flooding systems and complexities. So we have to think about what is the true cost of recovery? What is the true cost of saving an ecosystem and making it really resilient? And this is why we need to speak up, and speak up with a stronger voice here in this process, because when the cameras are gone, we're back to work. And really, we need to do a lot more work, and we need to have a lot more honest and transparent conversation on what's working, what's not working, and how we can collaborate, because SDG 17 is really about partnerships, that thread of partnership. Lastly, I just want to say, I'm very glad that water and food systems are finally high on the agenda of this COP, because the manifestation of justness manifests mostly around water systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's right. I mean, that's what we were saying the other day, that water seems to be really prominent, and with people like Danone, who you mentioned, very much in the forefront. Thank you so much, Dr. Musunda. Thank you, Minister and Vice President, for helping us set the scene just now with a really fascinating set of interventions. I'm going to ask our audience to thank you, and then I'm going to invite our next panel up to do actually exactly what you said just now, Dr. Musunda, which is to look at more closely what is working, what are we learning, what can we share, and to delve a little bit more deeply into the meaning of just resilience on the ground, sharing experiences both within Europe and out of it, and how we can actually turn this into something that really benefits communities. But for now, thanks to you. Thanks, everybody. So I will, as our speakers go to their next appointments and keep the fight going, I'm going to invite our next panelists to come and take a seat. As they do that, you sit wherever you like. I'm going to also invite our specialists to come and give us a presentation. I'm going to invite Moa Westman and also Roman Röhle. Let me introduce them first of all, and then we will move to the next panel. So Moa is a climate specialist in the team, but actually focusing very much on social inclusion and gender within the European Investment Bank. Roman is a climate change specialist. You've been working very closely on adaptation, and in fact, both of you are those who have spearheaded the work that we're talking about today. And that is the just resilience and the global application of the just transition. Okay, so after that, I'm going to invite our panelists to talk to me a little bit about what this actually means in practice. I'll introduce you in a moment. And also how we, picking up on some of the themes that we heard earlier, how we ensure that community is involved in this process. So I'm going to hand over to you first of all, Moa, and then we'll mic you up in a moment as well.
Thank you so much, Shirin. That is working well. So a just transition and putting people at the heart of climate policies and actions have really been a central theme at COP28 this year. So the approach that we are launching here today is really timely, and it is available online for anyone that would like to delve into it further. As has already been made clear through the high-level panel, we are looking at two areas of actions: supporting just transition efforts in communities where high-emission industries are phasing out and that therefore are the most affected by our efforts to decarbonize our economies, but also to scale up climate adaptation finance that support the countries and the people that are at the forefront and really affected by climate change itself, as well as by climate adaptation policies and actions to really support a just resilience. So, on the just transition side, our support is guided by three principles, learning from our experiences also from within inside the European Union around vulnerability, intent, and relevance. And we will start by targeting some of the most affected regions vulnerable to decarbonization efforts and where there's already an intention to transition away from high-emitting industries. We are going to start, and we are just starting. We are going to start in 5 countries in the Western Balkans and Ukraine, where we work closely together with various Team Europe initiatives, as well as in Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam, that, as the Commissioner mentioned in her opening remarks, are also part of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. In these locations, what we are hoping to do is to finance broad-based, multi-sector investments that really help build more sustainable and inclusive economies that do not replicate some of the past social and gender imbalances of the past. So therefore, we might support investments in education, in training and reskilling, support for the private sector, including small and medium-sized enterprises, low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure, and environmental rehabilitation. Together with partners, we hope to be able to also expand our technical advisory services to help clients plan for and implement just transition efforts, including in additional locations over time. And this is something we have seen working very well inside of the European Union. As the Vice President has also highlighted, our work has already but just started. Together with the European Commission, we have agreed to triple our technical advisory support for work in the Western Balkans, including for just transition efforts. And here at COP28, we signed together with other MDBs a declaration to support just transition efforts in Northern Macedonia. In October earlier this year, we also signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Vietnam to support just transition efforts in the most affected regions of their country. And we can't do this alone. That is the key message. We need to work in partnerships with local governments, with the private sector, and with think tanks and other international organizations. So this summarizes in very short words our support to just transition, and I'll hand over to my colleague Roman to take us through the just resilience.
Thank you, Moa. So what is just resilience? So it's something new for the EIB, and we heard about the concept as we were working on our EIB adaptation plan, which you should really look up on our website. When we were looking for ways to increase our adaptation finance and impact for the most vulnerable areas. The European Commission and the European Environment Agency were pioneering the just resilience concept at that time, and two key principles really resonated with us. Number one, recognizing that climate impacts are unequally distributed among countries and within countries, and that adaptation policies, secondly, should address differential social aspects for different groups and people for high impact. And we really like that very clear social lens on adaptation finance in the just resilience concept. And we really wanted to apply it to our global operations at the EIB. So we translated it to an approach that we could apply for our adaptation finance. And we used 3 sets of criteria based on our existing safeguards. And the 3 criteria really helped us to capture adaptation finance for the most vulnerable countries and places in least developed countries, small island development states, fragile countries, and for different people and groups that are most affected by the physical impacts of climate change. And I hope you can see a list of these groups that we were specifically considering on the slide. And lastly, those people and groups that are unequally affected by adaptation policies and actions, and that would really require specifically targeted activities to make them participate and benefit from adaptation action. Applying the criteria turned out to be a really great exercise for us, and it was really useful to understand what we are already doing to promote just resilience through our existing adaptation finance. And going forward, it will help us to provide more targeted support for high social impact through our adaptation finance and vice versa. So we're putting it out. It's new for us, and again, we're really looking to partner up with anybody who can help us to develop this further. Shireen, thanks.
Thank you very much, Roman, and also to Moa for that work that you've been doing. And also, obviously, it's not the end of it. This new approach that we've announced today, of course, will be implemented in 2024, and that's going to be the real test. And I think Moa and Roman, but also many of our colleagues at the European Investment Bank, and fellow multilateral development banks as well, who are all looking at this very closely to see what we can learn and how we can get on the right track. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to introduce the panel who are going to help us with this and who have been, most of you, good partners along the way, all of you actually, not most of you, good partners along the way to the European Investment Bank in terms of a lot of work that we're doing either around the world or in Europe. So let me introduce you first of all. I'm very happy to have Jochen Renger, who's director of the GIZ division on climate change. That's, of course, part of the German government's financing of development activities around the world. And you're focusing particularly on climate change, rural development and infrastructure. So thanks for being with us, Jochen. Ivan Sergeyev, who is the Just Transition Process Coordinator at the Ministry of Finance in Estonia. And I know Estonia is one of those countries where the Just Transition mechanism of the EU has already got some work going. And perhaps you're going to tell us a bit about that. Very happy also to welcome you, Alexandra Kemersajak, expert in environment, human health and well-being at the European Environment Agency, which of course has inspired a lot of the work that the EIB is now doing. So we're really looking forward to hearing a bit more about that. And then Martin Gar from the Blue Orchard Impact Investment Manager, Head of Corporate Development. Blue Orchard, of course, a very interesting fund, one that the EIB works with in Africa and Asia, I believe, particularly focusing on the climate resilience and in social inclusion space. So great to have you all with us. Maybe I can kick off with you first, Ivan, and ask you to tell us a little bit about, it wouldn't be COP28 if we didn't have, a bit of competition with the neighboring pavilions, so don't let it put you off. You're doing the transition coordination for the Estonian Ministry of Finance. So tell us a little bit about the Just Transition challenges in Estonia after 5 years of planning and implementing this, and what is working? And maybe what isn't, or what isn't working, or what is most challenging. Give us a sense of that, if you would.
All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Ivan. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for coming and seeing this event. So Estonia, the country we're talking about, is tiny, right? So it's less than 1.5 million people. Actually, our pavilion is right across the aisle, so you can go and check it out. But we're talking small numbers. Estonia is pretty tiny. We're located next to, sort of between Russia, Finland, Latvia, that corner. And Ida-Virumaa is one of the regions of Estonia, the easternmost region of Estonia, where we mine and exploit oil shale. Oil shale is a rock. It's not coal, but it's a rock that you can either essentially burn directly for deriving electricity or heat, or you can, through the process of pyrolysis, you can essentially squeeze oil out of it and make that into liquid fuel. So the Ida-Viru region is where the oil shale sector is concentrated, resulting that we have 15 regions altogether, but Ida-Viru is responsible for over 50% of all greenhouse gases.
You come from that region, don't you?
I do, yeah. Actually, yeah, I come from that region as well, so it's a little special. That's why I talk about it so much. But anyway, so yeah, we've been actually in the process of transition for a long time. Ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, our requirement, or like the need for energy, has drastically become smaller because most of the industry was oriented towards the east. Once the Union collapsed, then the industry collapsed with it. We sort of hit 50% savings on greenhouse gas emissions over like 3 years, just because we didn't need any energy anymore. And since then, we've sort of been kind of around the 20 million tons per year, let's say, level. And then in the recent years, we've been trying to actively decrease our emissions. And obviously that involves getting rid of oil shale or sort of phasing it down. We have committed to phasing out oil shale in electricity production by 35 and in liquid fuels by 2040. And obviously, as we do that, Idaviro gets hit the most. Oil shale sector employs about 10% of the working population of the region, and it accounts for about 25% of the GDP of the region. So you can imagine that if we phase that thing out, then it's sort of a big deal. And so, yeah, as I said, the transition has been ongoing for years, but in the latest years, thanks to the European Union's Just Transition Fund, we've had a more, how do I say, like a more structured approach to how we phase out oil shale. We've sort of mapped what the main challenges are, which are diversifying the economy. Obviously, if a huge chunk of your economy gets phased out, then you need something instead of it. So diversifying the region's economy is one major thing. The other one is supporting the people and communities that get, let's say, influenced by the transition. And that doesn't only mean oil shale workers themselves, but also the families. Also the women in the families, for example, the children in the families, because the women in the families typically do housework. The salaries of the oil shale sector employees are really high. So the women can, so to say, afford to stay at home, and so they're completely locked out of labor. On the other hand, kids, which see no future for them, they all know that oil shale is being phased out, they leave Idaviruma. So we've actually lost about 30% of our population in the last 30 years, which
from
is
the country or that of
from
that
the
region?
county, from that particular county,
from
that particular region.
30%. That's
30%.
huge.
That's a lot. So those are, let's say, the challenges, and what we're trying to do through the Just Transition Fund is to address those. So diversify the economy, invest in new facilities, come up with new jobs, develop, let's say, new industrial sectors. Support people. But what we've learned is that on the one hand, the partnership and outreach are super important, because otherwise you won't have ownership. So the community knows that we have to phase out. Obviously, people who depend on fossil fuel extraction and processing don't believe in climate change as much. So you sort of, through implementing the Just Transition Fund, you have to preach about why we're doing this in the first place. It has not reached that little corner of Estonia yet, really. And on the other hand, what you need to understand is that money won't solve everything. So you need to build capacity for the local SMEs to actually invest. Because a lot of local SMEs are, they exist while they exist, and then the owner retires, and then that's it, What do I care about climate change or Just Transition Fund? So you really need to reach out to people. You need to make it relevant for them. You need to make sure that they understand why we're doing all of this and that it actually pertains to them as well. And obviously there is never too little communication. So if we talk about challenges, then we touched a little bit of those. But yeah, just kind of a couple of messages that communication is super important, reaching out to people is super important, and money doesn't solve everything. You need to build capacity, and you need to invest into people and into their ability to actually take advantage of the fund, see opportunities in the crisis, and move on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's a very valuable insight. And I think, it goes without saying that without putting that effort, that the potential for big backlash is enormous, especially politically. So maybe, Martin, I can turn to you now at GIZ. You're looking actually at how the Just Transition is working through projects and financing out of Europe. Tell us a little bit about where you see particularly good examples, where you can share some of that, and what, if anything, you think we can learn for the sort of things that Ivan is telling us there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to EIB for inviting GIZ to this very important event. Just Transition is, a clear highlight of this COP28, and GIZ as a federally owned enterprise of the German government is currently engaged in approximately 25 countries supporting Just Transition processes. Just Transition processes at a very early stage, we must say. And one clear lesson learned so far is that, Just Transition is all about an inclusive, participatory, multi-stakeholder process. That is a clear lesson learned. It's not a top-down process. You really have to include, marginalized groups, indigenous groups. You have to include the poor, especially in Africa and Latin America, and certainly it's also a women's issue. So this kind of multi-stakeholder process is really paramount to clearly pave the way for a just transition. And what we do in most of the countries, we help our partner countries to facilitate these processes on the national level, on the regional level, but also on the very local level. And the very local level is important because, as you have outlined, it's the local population that is affected most by any kind of transition. And for most of the local communities, phasing out of coal, for instance, is a severe threat to their livelihood. And, just the announcement of, we are about to phase out or we are going to phase out is more or less, it's actually a kind of declaration of war. And you have to be very, very sensitive, and you have to listen carefully. What are these stakeholders thinking about their future? And a core principle of, just transition is simply leave no one behind. Otherwise, it's not going to be a just transition. And this, leave no one behind makes it absolutely necessary to have this kind of peer-to-peer learnings. We have a lot of, peer-to-peer learning formats so that affected people from the region can exchange and so on and so forth. And, the multi-stakeholder dialogue is not a goal in itself, But, what we can see is that, it brings first results in, developing options for just transition pathways. There is no blueprint of such a pathway, It has to be worked out jointly. And it's very interesting to see, what comes up from the local level in terms of what kind of visions do we have, what do we need, what is our, our vision of our future livelihood. And this is in particular important because you have to do this visioning exercise, Because the simple question is for the local people, what is the future we'd like to live in, and what kind of future we don't want to have?
Have you been doing this approach then in some of the projects that you're working on?
Yes, we have.
What sort of places have you done it?
Well, we've done this in Indonesia, for example. We've done this also in Brazil and Colombia. We did it in Vietnam, and I was visiting recently the Western Balkans, where the phase out of coal is also a big issue, and we are at a very early stage. So we are kind of in a phase of mobilizing civil society. We are also mobilizing the national level because it needs a lot of, political commitment to have this kind of multi-stakeholder processes.
That's very interesting. I think your phrase that it is perceived almost like a declaration of war is probably really true. I mean, being old enough to remember the miners' strikes in the UK in the 1970s, which, of course, weren't to do with climate change, but the reaction is as visceral. And it's not going to be solved by saying it's good for the planet, darling. So thank you for that. We've been talking about the just transition with you, and I want to turn a corner and go back to just resilience. Of course, there are many similarities, but for those, we're sort of halfway through the discussion, in case one hasn't totally understood the difference, of course, we're talking about the just transition where we're taking climate action to deal with decarbonization, whereas with just resilience, we're talking about the effects of climate change, what is integrated into our adaptation challenges. So, Alexandra, maybe I can come to you. The European Environmental Agency has been doing a lot of work here, as I mentioned. Maybe tell us a bit more about what just resilience means for you at the agency, and how you think we can learn from some of the lessons that you have to tell us.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yes, indeed, at the European Environment Agency, we've been looking into the concept of just resilience, because just resilience is included in the European strategy on adaptation to climate change. It's stated very firmly that no one should be left behind in adaptation to climate change. And we've known for a while that climate change affects people in a different way, depending on who they are, where they live, where they work. We know that the elderly are the most frequent victims of heat waves. We know that people on lower incomes tend to be more affected by flooding, for example. But maybe what is a bit less known is that the adaptation solutions are also likely to create winners and losers. So we can look at three aspects. We can look at whether the adaptation solutions are benefiting everyone in a society in an equitable way. To give an example, for example, if we invest in flood defense systems, if we use a very simple cost-benefit analysis, we are likely to protect the most valuable assets, with the most vulnerable communities being likely to end up being protected the last or the least. So we can look at this aspect of distribution. We can also look at the aspect of procedural justice, whether everyone can voice their concerns and be involved in the process. And that leads to this participatory aspect, to what extent people are actually engaged in the decision-making process that might be about their really life and death situation, as in the case of flooding or heat waves. So we've been looking at those aspects of both unequal impacts but also the potential inequalities in response. And because Europe is very much driven by the cohesion policy and reducing the disparities in society, we cannot create this sort of two-speed society in a way also in adaptation. And maybe to use the sort of metaphor of going for a hike in a group, you walk at the pace of the slowest people. You don't leave them behind. You need to adjust your actions to take care of the ones that are walking with you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back in a minute to hear a bit more of that. But let me turn to Martin from Blue Fund as well. As I said earlier, you're very much working in the space of climate resilience, but also social inclusion. So you know a little bit about this, if I can put it that way. Where do you see, in terms of your own work, some interesting models that might show a bit what that actually means, what just resilience actually means on the ground, especially, I mean, in as far as it integrates the community and makes sure the community benefits?
Yeah, very happy to talk about this. And before we go into a concrete fund example and a concrete investment example, just to introduce Blue Orchard as well. We are a leading impact investment manager, founded back in 2001, so we have more than 20-year track record. We manage more than 4.5 billion assets under management. And with that money, we are invested in more than 100 countries globally, primarily in emerging and frontier markets, so really the countries that are most affected from climate change. With this money, we're reaching more than 280 million people, so really a huge impact that we can make on the ground. We invest across asset classes, so private debt, private equity, sustainable infrastructure, and also fixed income. Since 2019, we are a partner and member of the Schroders Group, who has a 200-year history as an active investor. Now turning to the just resilience topic, one concrete example that I would like to mention here is a fund. It's called Inju Resilience Investment Fund. So it has the resilience name, resilience already in the fund name. There was a fund initiated together with KfW, the German Development Bank, back in 2017 as a debt and a private equity sub-fund. And the overall objective of the Injury Resilience Investment Fund is to contribute to the adaptation to climate change by improving access to and the use of insurance in emerging markets. The specific objective is really to reduce vulnerability of medium and small enterprises, as well as low-income households, to extreme weather events. As said, the first funds were launched back in 2017, and on the positive success of these funds, we launched the second vintage back in 2022 last year. The impact of these funds is really, we have a coverage of 35 million climate insurance beneficiaries, and that then scales up to vulnerable people of about 60 million. So a huge impact that this fund already has. Now, one concrete investment example from the second private equity fund is an African insurtech company. It's a pan-African platform that bundles insurance providers, more than 100 partners, together on a platform, and provides these insurances then to really small agri-farmers across Africa. The benefit is really increasing affordability to farmers, but then also the reach. And from a financial perspective, we are really trying to make a case and have a proof of concept to say, and to show that you can financially viable invest into insurance companies in emerging markets. We're doing this since 2017 as an impact investment manager. But at some point, we also would like to see insurance companies, reinsurance companies, really global player to come into this market and scale it up and really help
Exactly. That's what I wanted to ask you. So I guess that's the thing, is that this is still an area where those models are desperately needed, financing models.
Exactly.
Also the right kind of, proof in a sense. Yeah. But also then how do you scale them up? So you do get to that point where we can see bigger insurance companies offering those kind of products to smallholder farmers, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. And just yesterday we talked about blended finance. These funds are a blended finance structure. So that means we have junior capital in the fund, and then we're blending this with private institutional capital. So, 10 to 20%, maybe 30% is junior capital, and the remaining 70 to 90% is really institutional capital that is flowing into these funds.
Thank you very much for that. And you've brought us neatly into the topic of financing, but also partnerships, because clearly, listening to your examples there, the key is, as the financiers on the platform know very well, is putting together those platforms which either attract the right kind of money, or take the right kind of risk, or just deliver the right amount of finance. And Ivan, I want to ask you a bit about the partnership part of that. A double-pronged question, if I may. One is the partnership that you have with the European Union. So working with the Just Transition mechanism, with maybe structural funds. How does that impact on what you're able to do or what you're doing? But also, and you can answer any part of the question you prefer, but also coming back to the community involvement. I was very struck by something that Jochen said about, when you involve the community, you actually get better results. You can hear what they need because they're the ones that know. This sounds like an obvious point, but how do you make sure that the Estonian government, for whom you work, meaningfully involves the community in your decisions around financing and just transition? So we're getting into the just part of this discussion.
Oh my God, how much
time? I know, that was a really long question.
How much time do I have?
Okay, just give me a short answer to a long question.
All right, well, maybe let me start with the simple bit, like the partnership with the EU.
Yeah.
So the partnership with the EU does a great job as far as coordinating and just kind of making sure that the Just Transition Fund means something, that it is implemented the way it should be. For example, the European Commission set up such a thing as a Just Transition platform, where representatives who deal with the just transition in all the countries of the EU come together twice a year to exchange experiences, show best practices. There is a just transition experts network. There is all sorts of like this assistance, let's say, involved, and that works beautifully. The other part of that makes EU great at these kind of things is that, as Alexander mentioned, we have a vast experience in cohesion policy. So Just Transition Fund is just another cohesion fund, really, within the EU framework. It is very geographically targeted. It has a specific policy objective, but otherwise, a lot of things are the same as with the other ones. For example, the regional innovation systems, trying to address that, then also trying to address the, let's say, the local, what do you call it, the smart specialization strategy framework, things like this. They've worked before, they work in the Just Transition Fund as well, and they provide a wealth of ways of not just visualizing what the future could be like, but sort of landing it into the local economic reality of like, okay, what are we good at? What are we bad at? What are the threats? What should we develop? What are the, okay, we're phasing out, let's say, fossil fuels. So what should we do instead? Should we do this, that, or the third thing? And so in order to figure that out, the EU framework of cohesion policy helps a lot. Now the second aspect, let's say the community aspect. Well, we have a steering committee that involves 20 different actors, ministers, the local development organizations, the NGOs, the youth, actually. And so through that steering committee, we sort of measure the temperature of how it's going. The steering committee also helps us develop the Just Transition Plan that we have. So that's the biggest instrument probably. And then, as I mentioned before, communication is paramount, and I mean that. Because we have a lot of seminars, we're setting up a completely different communication strategy for the Just Transition Fund, because again, there is never too much explanation. And something that I wanted to maybe touch on in what Gohun, you said, is that we now are from the planning phase in the implementation phase. Yes. And I gotta tell you, this is a whole different beast. Because you might have an amazing plan, like we did. We had a beautiful plan. We knew exactly what we were going to do. We had companies lined up for the grants and the different support schemes. And then we had the war by Russia in Ukraine happen, where on the eastern border of Estonia, we're right next to Russia. So half the companies exited. Then we had the energy crisis, then we had the inflation, now we have the hike rates. So you might have a great plan, but when things go wrong, or when they go differently than what you planned, the community is going to show signs of being like losing faith. And that is incredibly important to keep that faith. Because you can plan all you want, but if you're incapable of actually implementing what you've planned in the changing circumstances, with all the lack of faith, with all the drawbacks, with everything, then, good job planning. So in that sense, visualizing or visioning the future is super important, and I agree with that. But what we learned in our experience is that later, you have to continue with the communication. You have to keep the community on board. You can't just leave it at planning phase and then let's go and spend some money. Essentially, what you need to do, it's a long-term process. You're entering into that knowing that it's almost like a family relationship. You need to carry that community with you. Yes. You need to listen to them when things don't go quite as well as they're supposed to. Then the jobs that we're creating, they're only going to emerge in 2-3 years. People are losing jobs right now. How are you going to explain that? So things like this, they're very important. Yes. So I guess my takeaway would be, we cannot think of it as just planning something beautiful and then execution is going to happen by itself. Yes. Execution, it's never automatic gear shift. It's always manual. It's like a rally. So once you're into the Just Transition framework, you need to get ready that it's going to be a long-term commitment and something that you're doing together for the whole thing, for the whole period. And so, yeah, I guess that's my message.
It's a very good message, and you're clearly the guy for the job, right? I think they're lucky to have you, I think. I see some of your colleagues in the audience there. They seem to agree. Martin, let's just jump back to different environments where, and keeping with this idea of partnership as well. I know that you're working at Blue Orchard very closely with some microfinance institutions, and that is obviously a kind of a model of an institution that's very close traditionally to the communities. What does that mean in practice? I mean, how does that partnership work in practice? How do you think, what resonance does it have for what we're talking about today as well?
Yeah, so microfinance institutions or any other investees where we provide debt capital or private equity capital, these partnerships are really important to really channel the capital then to the end beneficiaries, which are SMEs quite often, or then also, really people on the ground. The way it really works is, or works well, is going back to this blended finance concept, which quite often comes with technical assistance, grant money, which can help to further just resilience and just transition concepts. Taking one example of an Indian investee, it's an insurance company, has so far had traditional insurance products. And through this technical assistance grant, we were able to, again with local partners also, introduce new products, products which work on a parametric insurance scheme. So the payout can be much easier and much faster. It's not as cumbersome as traditional insurance products. It's really just taking the example of a drought. So once temperatures increase above a certain threshold, immediate payout happens. And this introduction of a parametric insurance was funded through this grant money, and really helped the insurance company to insure local communities.
And the communities that are most impacted by climate change.
Yeah, so that's typically local farmers in rural communities, which otherwise wouldn't really have access to insurance.
Thank you for that. Let me turn to GIZ again. I mean, I want to ask you more still about the partnership theme. Where do you see where do you see the most impactful partnerships coming from? Who should be in them in terms of actually pushing forward what we're talking about today, the just transition, the global just resilience approach? And maybe if I can add on to that, where do you see, for example, institutions like the GIZ and multilateral development banks like the EIB working together? What can they bring to the table, do you think?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I like it very much. And I am also happy that we embark on, thinking about partnership arrangements, because just transition is nothing that you can do in a solo run. No way. So you need to partner up. And we have experienced, after the last COP, the emerging just energy transition partnerships, which is the first step to include a group of supporters focusing on one specific country, such as South Africa, for instance. When it comes to partnering up, well, it's the combination that counts. GIZ is offering a capacity development. So what we are doing basically is to help our partner countries to establish an institutional framework conducive to sustainable development, or conducive to just transition in our case here. And at the same time, we enable our partner countries' organizations to cope with the situation, to do the job, and so on and so forth. And this brings me in here also in just transition, because money alone won't make it. As we have learned from you, I mean, it's a hell of a job to handle a just transition. And you need to have the right institutional framework in place, and you have to have capable organizations that can, implement the just transition, or even plan the just transition. So what I can see in, combining capacity development with financing, what we can do is we can pave the way for a just transition in order to prepare and make countries ready to absorb financial aid, especially in infrastructure. That's one thing. The other thing, what we are doing already in countries such as Indonesia, is that we are helping Indonesia to prepare meaningful projects, that are attractive to, investment banks or to multilateral development banks or even to the private sector. The private sector only moves in when the private sector is convinced, okay, our investment will pay off somehow. And this is what we can do as GIZ. We can do a little bit of risk management. We can actually pave the way. And then when it comes to implementation of large-scale infrastructure projects, which is quite a challenge, we are talking about large-scale infrastructure, then it makes also sense to accompany our partners in the phase of implementation to build up the capacities to do a sound learning so that at the end of the day or at the end of particular projects, they are ready to do everything by themselves.
Thank you so much. Now, you've mentioned, I'm going to give Alexandra a final word on the panel, but I then want to turn to our experts perhaps very quickly before we round up and finish to reflect on what you may have heard that actually will be helpful when we come to implementing all of this, both in terms of the just transition globally, but also the just resilience. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that. But I'm going to turn to Alexandra. Jochen mentioned the need for systems, institutional capacity, and financing. But none of this is going to happen, is it, without data and knowledge? So perhaps you can help us with that. What do we need in terms of data and knowledge to ensure that these transitions are genuinely inclusive, genuinely just? And where do you see, I'm going to tack on another little bit there, but where do you see the next frontier, in a sense, if I can put it that way, in understanding that climate social nexus even better?
Yes, indeed, data is very important, and we are very good at environmental data, at collecting environmental data, at projecting environmental data. The climate models that were developed 20 years ago actually came up with what we're seeing today. But we are not so good with the socioeconomic data, with understanding who is vulnerable and in what context. And I think that's where the local partnerships are really important, because then vulnerability really, really varies between different countries, between different localities. To give you an example, in Europe, it's men who are much more likely to lose their lives in floods because of risk-taking behaviors, because of being more frequently the driver of a vehicle. But in non-Western world, it's women who are much more likely to lose their lives. And these sort of different nuances are also present at the very local level. So working with local authorities, working with local communities who have the best understanding what makes them exposed to climate change, how they are vulnerable to climate change is absolutely key. We also need the data on the implementation of actions. We are absolutely brilliant at planning. We have adaptation policies at national level, at local level, but we know very little about what's actually being implemented. And when it's implemented, what effect does it have? So we need to know if let's say, a project on greening the city, did it bring a relief for heat for the disadvantaged communities, or did it result in gentrification of an area, rents going higher, and the poor people living and moving to a different location? So I think what's absolutely key is the long-term monitoring of the effectiveness of the project, not just the spending of the money and what has been achieved, but also what effect it had in a longer term. And this is what I actually see as one of the frontiers for the future. How do we measure resilience, and how do we measure just resilience? how do we know that we've actually arrived at the destination that we planned in our beautiful policies and strategies? So I think that's where we need to really focus our attention at.
Absolutely, and I think there's an important lesson there for all of our institutions. Before we wrap up, maybe I can invite Moa and Roman, or both of you or either of you, to come and just give us a sense of what you've heard in the last hour or so that may be new or inspiring or important as you, and I think it is you guys, who are going to be leading the work in the EIB, but I think, as I said earlier, something that others will be watching very closely, particularly within the multilateral development bank community, as to what actually putting a just resilience approach into practice will mean. Over to you for a few minutes, and then...
Thank you so much, Shirin, and thanks to all the panelists. I think for me, some of the key takeaways today is that social inclusion and participation has to be at the heart of any climate action, whether if we're looking at decarbonization processes or building more inclusive resilience. I think another key message from today's panel that I've picked up on is that the drivers are common. So we have common drivers of the challenges being decarbonization, but how this manifests itself locally is very local. And that's why we really need local solutions and the involvement of different communities. I think also we heard, which is important for us to keep in mind, that finance is only one piece of the puzzle. There is a lot of other areas of work that needs to be looked into around capacity building and technical assistance, and therefore underlying the importance of partnerships. I think we're also seeing the different type of actors that need to come in. We need to operate at the micro level, but also bringing in some sort of scale to really make sure that the transitions are scalable and just.
Thank you, Moa. Thank you so much to all of you, Martin, Alexandra, Ivan, and Jochen as well. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. Thank you to all of you as well in the audience and online for listening. As I said earlier, you can pick up the recording on the YouTube channels of the EIB, and we wish you well along your way. Thanks.